Thank you, everyone, and I'll hand over to Mr. Bilahari.
Okay, thank you. I shall try to be very brief. First of all, I don't see that there's anything particularly unusual or exceptional in US-China strategic competition. This kind of competition is inherent in the nature of international relations. Um, and so there's nothing to explain, really, you know. And it is very traditional great power competition of the usual kind. In this competition, except for very short and exceptional periods where it has usually gotten into trouble, the US, since the end of the Second World War, has been the offshore balancer. The exception, of course, was in the Korean War, which was a mistake because it kind of defined its defense perimeter with too much clarity, leading to miscalculation on the other side. And the other time when he got into even bigger trouble is, of course, in the Middle East, in Iraq in 2003. Otherwise, if you look at the pattern of US activity in the world as a great power, it has always been the offshore balancer. Minor intervening here and there, but basically staying offshore. And that's the basic role it has played in Asia. Again, the one exception which got into trouble is the Vietnam War or the Indochina conflict. And in 1969, I think the US role as the offshore balancer has been made very clear through the Nixon Doctrine, which basically said, and I'm summarizing, you all are going to have to take more responsibility of your own for your own defense from now on. It's not, I am not going to get involved on the mainland of Asia anymore. Now, an offshore balancer's relationships with his friends and his allies always oscillates between fear of entanglement on the part of his friends and allies if the offshore balancer is too aggressive, and fear of abandonment if it is too passive. And that has been the US fate. Sometimes you have called it, and more recently, you have called it retreat. But remember, US policy oscillates. It has always oscillated. It moves in waves and troughs. You have to understand both the waves and the troughs, but not make the mistake of thinking that either is a permanent condition. Let me say a few words with that broad framing about the South China Sea, because I don't think Colin will agree with me. Or he may agree with me, but not in every particular. I think that the situation in the South China Sea is very largely a stalemate. The US is not going to be able to make the China either scale down its ridiculously wide claims, almost over 80-something% of the South China Sea, or make the Chinese dig up those artificial islands it has constructed and throw the sandbag in the sea, or in time is not going to be able to stop the Chinese from deploying military assets on those islands. On the other hand, the Chinese are not going to be able to deter the US from operating in the South China Sea, over the South China Sea, through the South China Sea, unless it's willing to risk war. And I don't think the Chinese are willing to risk war, because although the Chinese military has made great strides, I think there is no doubt, including in the minds of the Chinese, what the outcome of that war will be. The best outcome will be a stalemate, a draw. And that would be quite disastrous for the Communist Party. Those islands, and even if you deploy military assets on them, are from a military point of view quite useless. If there is ever a serious conflict between the US and China, those islands will disappear within the first half hour. So what is their purpose? What are the purpose of those claims? They are much more political, I think, than military or strategic. They are meant to intimidate the other claimant states. They are meant to demonstrate China's new status and position. And they are meant to put some meat on the bones of that revanchist narrative of rejuvenation, by which the Communist Party of China now justifies its rule. It's a very revanchist narrative because it's a narrative of that for 200 years, for 100 years, I've been humiliated, I've lost a lot of stuff, now I'm back, I'm going to take it back. But in reality, they can't take it back. Most of what is lost is now the Russian Far East. Another big piece of what they lost is Mongolia. One part belongs to Russia. One small part belongs to Russia, the rest is an independent country. And most of all, what they have lost is Taiwan. Can they get it back? Again, it risks a big war with the US. I'm not saying war is not going to occur. In a state system, that's always a possibility. But if it occurs, it will be by accident, not by a deliberate design. One more point about the South China Sea. I think you started by saying that the US is retreating from its commitment to internationalism. Well, I think you have to look at that commission to both the idea of retreat and the idea of commitment to internationalism very carefully. First of all, I don't see how you can, first of all, you may agree with Mr. Trump's policies, you may disagree with Mr. Trump's policies, but since he has made explicit his intention, made explicit both in word and deed to compete robustly, not just with China, but with Russia, I don't see how you can accurately describe that as a retreat. Also, the commitment to internationalism has to be very carefully examined. As I said in the beginning, US policy oscillates. It oscillates between an emphasis on multilateralism to an emphasis on unilateralism and bilateralism. It oscillates between a commitment to free trade and an emphasis on fair trade. It oscillates in many poles over many issues. And that's the general pattern of American foreign policy. If you look at the whole post-World War II period, or you look at the whole 20th century, why not? The period of clear American commitment to internationalism was actually very, very short. Maybe 20-odd years from 1989, when the Berlin Wall went down, to say 2008, 2009, when the global financial crisis broke out. In the early part of the 20th century, America was only sporadically involved in international affairs. Now, those sporadic interventions were often very decisive, as its intervention in the First World War and the Second World War, and so on. But more often, it was the American commitment to internationalism was only half the equation. It was never uncontested, either internationally or within America. It's only a very short, exceptional period that we now mistake for the norm. One last point, the American positions, I have always had this suspicion about American position on the South China Sea. People forget that it has been a very reluctant player on the South China Sea. When it first became a major issue in the mid-1990s, I remember the ASEAN countries had really to work very hard to get the US to declare a position on the South China Sea. It just wasn't interested. It wasn't interested because its attitude was, I don't care, I can operate here, who's going to stop me? So that's all these small disputes and, are all your problem, not mine. And this thing about upholding a rules-based order is a rather relative development in US policy towards the South China Sea. Before that, the pendulum the oscillation was on the unilateral side. Their attitude, very explicitly articulated, was, who's going to stop me? I don't care. So you want to have this, I don't care whether this little island or atoll or reef belongs to China or Vietnam or Philippines. This is trivial. Even today, I think there is less difference between the Chinese position in the South China Sea and the American position than either would care to admit, or they pretend. Look at it. There is no difference in their position of what is allowed in territorial waters, whether in the South China Sea or any other ocean. There's no difference in their position of what is allowed on the high seas, whether in the South China Sea, that there are little bits that are not territorial waters or thing. And you remember, I think, Colin, you will correct me, is it 2015 when there was a RIMPAC exercise? And the Chinese were invited, they participated, and they also sent a spy ship to snoop around in the same way that the Americans send spy ships to snoop around. And what was interesting about the episode in 2005 is, unasked, the Ministry of Defense of China issued a statement that could have been written by the 7th Fleet. Basically, they said this kind of activity is allowed in EEZs, which is exactly the American position. Later on, they have kept quiet about their subsequent excursions because I think they realized they made a mistake. My point here is that a country's concepts, interpretations of international law are very often a function of its capabilities. China can only launch that kind of surveillance mission now sporadically. And that's why it does not use that justification that these things are actually allowed, except for that one time that I can check, that I know of. But if China's capabilities develop as they will, you might see their concepts of what is allowed in EEZ also change. I have some sympathy, although it's a disingenuous argument, for the Chinese argument that I do not interfere with freedom of navigation, despite my claims. The American counter argument is also valid, that there's a difference between freedom of navigation as a favor given by some major power or as a right enshrined in international law. But what the Americans don't say is they have not signed UNCLOS either, and they say they abide by UNCLOS as customary international law. That is also a disingenuous argument, because it also means that I am abiding it by my leave and favor, by political convenience, not as a legal right. Anyway, enough of that. One last point. When we look at US-China competition, we pay far too much attention to the sea. I think there's nothing unusual about the Chinese trying to develop from a land continental power into a maritime power, because they have become a major trading nation. And there isn't in history any major trading nation that has not been a maritime power. They are still very far behind the US. And don't forget, they are trying to catch up with a moving target. The US is not static either. But by and large, on the sea, where they are competing now, which is the South China Sea and a bit of the Pacific, it's more or less a stalemate. We don't pay enough attention to what is happening on land, particularly in Southeast Asia. The dams that the Chinese are constructing in the upper reaches of the Mekong, and in fact, the upper reaches, not just of the Mekong, but of all the major Asian rivers, originate in Chinese territory, and indisputable Chinese territory, gives them a strategic advantage that has been insufficiently studied. Recently, of course, this is not going to be very relevant to the Middle East or the Persian Gulf, but recently, you might have noticed a study of satellite photographs and other data that has shown that the droughts that have plagued the Mekong countries, in the lower Mekong countries, are actually being caused not by natural causes, but may have been caused or contributed to by Chinese damming activity in the upper reaches. And that is of greater potential strategic significance, I think, than anything that's happening in the South China Sea. And I'll stop here. By the way, what time are we supposed to finish?
4:30. 4:30.
Sorry?
4:30.
Okay, that's fine then. Thanks. All right, I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you, Bilahari. We'll go to Dr. Colin Ko.
Can't hear you, Colin.
You're on mute.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks, Ambassador Bilahari, and also thanks, MEI, for inviting me for this conversation. I just want to make a few brief points on China Sea because Ambassador Bilahari has already covered quite a bit of what I actually wanted to cover, and I do actually agree with the points they have raised. I just want to give a sort of context to what we have seen recently in the context of the pandemic currently. So, I think there are some commentaries out there recently about what China is doing in the South China Sea, and arguing that, there is a new pattern of what China is currently doing in the South China Sea when it comes to, the installation of new research stations, the creation of 2 separate administrative districts for the Paracels and the Spratly Islands, and, the host of coercive activities. These are new activities that take place under pandemic. I mean, to me, this is rather sensationalist. There is nothing really new in terms of the pattern that we see. The only new thing that we see is the context of the pandemic that gives China what I will call a window of opportunity to pursue essentially what it has planned to pursue long ago. And it all actually dated back, in the very, initial beginnings of Xi Jinping's, coming to office back in 2012, when he actually emphasized that, China's maritime sovereignty and rights had to be secured. And, he actually advocated a much more muscular approach in doing that. And since 2012, we've been seeing, a sort of a gradual ramping up of China's more muscular approach in the South China Sea anyway. So if we could put an explanation to what we saw recently in the South China Sea, we could, see from the initial beginnings of the outbreak of the coronavirus, these moves will be deemed as necessary to distract public attention in China from the CCP's handling of the crisis by rallying the nation around a nationalistic agenda. So it is a form of externalization. And of course, it is necessary, I mean, as far as, the PLA especially is concerned, it is important because you need to be proactive amidst speculations on whether the military recently, was being affected by the outbreak. It's not the US military, because, at the very beginning, PLA was also mired in speculations about whether it has been subjected to the infections and how ready it was when it comes to the various, flashpoints in a region like the South China Sea. So you found that actually the PLA in the recent times has been more proactive, especially, in terms of reporting the FONOPs by the US Navy. I mean, this was rather unprecedented. It used to be the US side being the first to announce, be it through the formal press release or through so-called leaked information to the Western media, by which, they will talk about FONOPs being conducted. But, in the very recent FONOPs, we saw that the Chinese were the ones who initiated reporting about the FONOP to show that they are proactive. It is in as much for domestic audience and as for the external. And of course, the current coercion, if we take what we saw in China, with some sort of face value of what they claim to be success in defeating the virus and gradually recovering from it, it is a continuation. But insofar what we saw as, long-term disturbing trends of China's economy and, social stability in the coming years from the pandemic itself, I think there are some issues to be worried. I mean, one is certainly concerning Xi Jinping's idea about a Chinese dream of achieving a moderately prosperous middle-income nation in at least one more decade's time. And the pandemic comes in to sort of wreck up the entire game plan. So what we saw is, notwithstanding China's state propaganda that, things are going well, we are recovering robustly, I think there are some undercurrent beneath all this propaganda. I think one is to deal with the bad consumer sentiments in China, despite the picking up of exports. Since, what happened in the past 3 months, the unemployment levels that, the figures are disputed. The Chinese state media is rather candid about the issue of unemployment. But the one thing they have not revealed to the public is to what extent has unemployment been so bad in China. And there were some existing reports that could have indicated that the unemployment rate could have been much worse than has been admitted by China. And of course, generally it sets back the CCP's nationwide poverty alleviation goal that is instrumental in achieving that Chinese dream that Xi Jinping has in mind. So therefore, it brings me to the context that we're going to see this year and the next, especially because next year will be the centennial of the Communist Party. They're going to celebrate the 100-year anniversary. There's a need to show report card. External, achievements might be necessary if the domestic situation isn't going on very well. So as far as the South China Sea is concerned, Beijing is only been able to uphold current arrangements with, say, Duterte's Philippines as a shining example of how China and the rival claimants in the South China Sea have been able to promote cooperation so far. Whereas with the rest, it has been more or less in a stalemate. So, but the one thing that I want to really add on is, contrary to those commentaries that China is seeking to unilaterally exploit energy resources in the disputed waters, I think more importantly is to note that China's goal ultimately is to attain bilateral joint development deals. It has been buoyed by the existing success with Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin back in the early 2000s and more recent agreement with the Philippines to agree to jointly explore the prospect of development, and now is seeking the same arrangements with other claimants. With Malaysia, this has been, an ongoing proposal by China, but, it's quite apparent that Kuala Lumpur hasn't been, taking up the offer, and China has been subtly trying to nudge Malaysia into that direction, but failed so far. So it could at least in part explain the strategic motivation behind the recent West Capella standoff off Sarawak. And, by and large, I would, access that China is using these current window of opportunity that is being given by the pandemic, such that the ASEAN claimants have been very, very busy trying to grapple with the virus outbreak. And of course, the perceived problems that the US military seems to be facing when it comes to, promoting a forward deployed presence in the region in order to improve its position in the South China Sea, with the hope that it will draw a minimal pushback. And of course, this window is timely since the ongoing talks on the code of conduct has been stopped due to the virus. And it's likely that China is doing all that in order to strengthen its position so that when talks restart, they could become a much stronger bargaining leverage over the other parties in the code of conduct talks. Right now, if we go back to what we saw as the broader strategic rivalry between China and the US in the South China Sea. On that score, I agree with Ambassador Bilahari. We see a stalemate. We see here a counter-posturing between China and the US. Note that neither power has incentives to roll back their activities in the South China Sea. For China, rolling back is going to carry immense costs from the domestic political perspective, especially when we talk about the political legitimacy of the CCP as well as Xi Jinping's personal prestige will be at stake. That is for China. For the US, to roll back carries an immense cost as well, and insofar its security commitments to the region is concerned, not least to mention that the South China Sea has featured very heavily in the free and open Indo-Pacific that the Trump administration has been advocating for the region. So, by and large, the South China Sea will be deemed as at least one of, if not the only litmus test of the US commitment to this strategy under the Trump administration. So there is no way the two sides will concede on the South China Sea yet. I would conclude by saying that both sides have no incentives to go to war. I think ultimately they may do counter-posturing, but they have no appetite to have an open armed confrontation with each other. The one context I want to finally bring into is to consider that compared to back in the old decades, especially in the immediate post-Cold War decades, I think what we saw as military confidence and security building mechanisms between China and the US in the past 1 decade or so are actually more developed than before, Therefore, they will serve as some sort of a pressure valve to prevent or to mitigate the risk of military confrontation. So notwithstanding the broader geopolitical dynamics or competition we see between China and the US, it may not necessarily translate into these two countries coming to blows in the South China Sea because of what I see as predominantly domestic concerns that the two countries are grappling with. And with the pandemic, it might potentially become worse in the coming years. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Colin. We'll now move on to Dr. Abdullah Babood to take us to the Persian Gulf.
Thank you, Amin, and I want to also echo what has been said by Ambassador Balhari and Dr. Colin Cole, and just to take you a little bit from the South China Sea to the Middle East and see if we can make some linkages there. Well, as you know, the Americans reluctantly moved into the Gulf in the 1970s for Pax Americana to replace Pax Britannica, as it were. And from boots of the ground, from offshore balancing, they got much more entangled and involved in Middle Eastern conflicts. They've had ups and downs in this. They made a lot of mistakes as well in the process. And currently, or at least during the Obama administration, there was the talk of the pivot to Asia. Now, whether one believes that or not, or was it a real strategy, or it was just a part of a strategy, it actually made a lot of change in the Middle East, and especially in the Gulf countries. And since then, we have seen the Gulf states starting to take matters into their own hand and becoming much more active and even military active in many ways. And they wanted to become less reliant on the United States, given the fact that not only the announcement of the pivot, but also certain US policies that made them think twice about how committed is the United States to their own security. And just to mention, it's just the conflict with Iran and the attacks on the oil tankers in the Sea of Oman, and of course the Aramco installations, etc. And that made the Gulf states think seriously about what is where should they take their security and how they should deal with it. Having said that, I don't think I'm letting out a secret here. The Gulf states themselves are not in agreement between themselves, and they are in competition and they are in conflict between themselves. And I mean about even within the GCC states, but within between the GCC and also Iran, Iraq, and of course the war in Yemen. So if there is anything that one can describe the region at the moment, is the total chaos. And unfortunately, and I think the United States is aware of this, and they are, I think, not totally ignoring the difficulties, and they're not pulling out, because it's still for them, despite the fact that they start to have their own oil, shale oil, etc. They're still very much dependent on the security and stability of the region, because of many reasons, including that the fact that oil is a strategic commodity, and even though they're not importing as much as they used to, in their role as the hegemonic power ensures that they really care for the region. As well as, of course, there are other reasons, fight against radicalization and terrorism, etc., that makes them involved in the region. And the competition, of course, between the United States and Iran, or the conflict between them, that keeps the United States interested in the region to a certain extent. They are not certainly moving. I agree with with the previous speakers, they're not changing strategically their positions. However, I think there is a recalibration of their policies, and I think they want to get the regional countries to be much more involved in guaranteeing their own security, and also they want to get some international countries that benefit from the region to do some burden sharing. Now, when it comes to this becomes quite tricky. How does China come into to play here? But also Russia. Obviously, the Americans want to keep the Chinese and the Russians out, despite the fact that the Chinese and the Russians are started to move in and started to gain some inroads into the region. As you know, China already has 2 bases, at least in the region. One is in Djibouti, in East Africa, and the other one is in Jawadar in Pakistan, which is really close to the Gulf and to Strait of Hormuz. They realize how important is the region, and how important is, of course, the oil supplies and the security of Strait of Hormuz. As you know, out of almost 13.6 million barrels that passes through the Strait of Hormuz, almost 26% of that goes to China. And China is becoming more dependent on the Gulf, and as Ambassador and Chairman Ambassador Belahari had mentioned, when you are a major trade nation, you need to move in and also protect your trade routes. So I think China is certainly finding or trying to find ways to move in. Their ships are around. The naval ships are around in the region, trying to protect, against piracy, etc. The Russians have come up with a proposal whereby they wanted it to be implemented through the Security Council. But the Americans basically brushed it aside, and they're not interested in talking about that. And the Russian proposal is much more inclusive, comprehensive, based on the United Nations, if you like, principles and resolutions. And no one is interested, apart from, of course, China that supported it, and Iran that supported it. So who else is trying to do something in the region? Of course, the Iranians came up with a proposal called the Hormuz Hope project, and basically that proposal calls for the withdrawal of international powers from the region, and for the countries of the region to create their own security architecture, which is obviously not going to go anywhere with that, because for the countries in the region, especially the smaller Gulf states, American security umbrella is paramount to them. And I think the Gulf countries are now facing a really serious issue, and that is for their prosperity and economic well-being, they're becoming much more dependent on Russia and China, while for their military security, they are dependent on the US and the West. And I think they will come under a lot of pressure to choose sides, one way or the other. And I think they're trying to navigate through very difficult waters. Now, the French has also started their own initiative through the EU, and they created, with other 8 EU member states, and they created some kind of a European maritime awareness to protect the Strait of Hormuz. So here, we have the Europeans coming back, if you like. And the US has also created another operation called Operation Sentinel, and that included, beyond the US, also Australia, Bahrain, Israel, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the UK as well. Again, to protect the Strait of Hormuz. Japan and South Korea are also moving in, because both countries are dependent on oil from the region. So what we are seeing is a really messy picture. And of course, we should not forget the whole idea of MESA, the Middle East Security Initiative that was announced by President Trump, which of course hasn't gone anywhere, but includes all the regional powers. This messy picture is going to continue for a very long time, because of the conflict between Iran and the United States, and also the region, some of the regional states. Hopefully, looking, if you like, ahead, if there was a change in the leadership in the United States after November, we could see some change in this policy. We could perhaps see some kind of a rapprochement between Iran and the United States. You could see some resemblance, going back, some resemblance of the GCPOA. And perhaps that will reduce tension in the region, where we can have a much more robust regional structure that includes all the regional country, that is inclusive, comprehensive, and includes, I feel like, international powers. But I think as far as the United States is concerned, they will want to keep Russia out, and they want to keep China out at all costs at the moment. And I think I should end there, if you like. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abdullah. Now we'll ask here, if anyone has any question, you can either unmute yourself and speak, or you can raise your hand, and or you can type out the question and I will present it to our speakers. But before opening it up to everyone else, I want to throw in a couple of questions for our speakers today. One is specifically maybe for Bilahari and Colin, is that even if there is no large-scale confrontation between the US and China, as you suggested, that it seems like, or if it happens, it'll be at very good grave cost. But what about slow, sort of small-level conflict or low-level conflict? Do you think that would continue for a while? Because in the Middle East, we're familiar that no large-scale war doesn't mean no war. It just means that it's being fought in other scales. So what would that mean? And also, secondly, like part of taking control of a new oceanic space comes with a sense of responsibility as well. So it means that you have to do certain services such as combating piracy or resolving conflicts between two smaller powers. Do you see China taking an additional role in those capacities as well in this area, where they're more, I know they have some small-scale piracy operation, but will they be more sort of upfront, more aggressive with that? And would you see also them standing in as an arbitrator for other states in resolving conflict? Or will that role continue to be the US as the ultimate arbitrator? Thank you. Either one of you. Bilal, you're on mute. Sorry.
I think there's one very fundamental difference between what's happening in the South China Sea and what's happening in the Gulf. China claims as its domestic sea, under the jurisdiction of its domestic law, most of the South China Sea. Nobody has done that in the Persian Gulf, right? So what China does, even if it is ostensibly for the common good, let's say putting down pirates, has a completely different signature in the South China Sea, and will elicit a much more ambiguous response, particularly from the claimant states, because it will be an assertion of their domestic law in the South China Sea, rather than acting on the behalf of a global commons. And that's a very fundamental difference. Second, that said, I have to say, and please don't misunderstand me, all the actors in the South China Sea are far more rational than all the actors in the Persian Gulf. Right? It's not that nobody has resorted to force. China has, Vietnam has, but in the 70s, in the early 80s. And then there have been occasional skirmishes. The kind of things that you see the Iranian Revolutionary Guard doing, you know, with their speedboats and that kind of thing, and you kind of see the other side planting mines on boats and all that, has not so far, and I don't think will happen in the South China Sea. If there is a conflict, it will be by accident. And if there is an accident between the US and China, I think both of them will do the utmost to contain it as quickly as possible. That's the difference, I think.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah, of course you must.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think there's a few things to set into context. I think one is to note that for the South China Sea, I mean, the South China Sea is actually a large body of water in all. If you look at the existing mapping of the sea routes that run through the South China Sea, much of the most heavily used sea routes don't run through, you know, the disputed waters for the most part. They actually hug the coast of the surrounding littoral states. For example, Vietnam's coast, and of course along the Chinese coast near to Hainan. The reason is largely pragmatic. I mean, one is, of course, you know, if not for other reasons, shippers, they will tend to avoid contentious areas. They don't get mired into, you know, political issues. That's one. Second is that, you know, if you talk about, you know, hugging the coast of the littoral states in the South China Sea, it gives them much radial access to help if they need it. For example, if they are being, you know, attacked by pirates, then the concerned states could actually come to their aid. I give this context because it actually leads us on a very different understanding of how or what we see in the Persian Gulf or the Gulf of Aden by and large, and of course the South China Sea, where, you know, it's very difficult to actually come up with a very robust type of cooperation where all the stakeholders in the region could come together on a common framework, say, you know, a South China Sea counter-piracy initiative that would be similar to what we saw in the Malacca Strait, for example. That is not likely to happen. In a few years ago, there was some discussion about, you know, potentially joint patrols in the southern end of the South China Sea. And those were not disputed waters, by the way, but of course the media tend to conflate it with South China Sea, and then it always gives the connotation that, you know, it will be in the disputed waters. That's not true. Even in the undisputed waters, but, you know, nonetheless, there are porous borders, and there are still those, you know, unresolved issues of sovereignty. Even with that, it's not possible to come up with cooperation, and that actually limits China's options when it comes to providing those so-called public goods. For example, counter-piracy in the South China Sea. I understand there are some discussions between China Coast Guard with the regional counterparts on, you know, tackling non-traditional security issues. But I think on this score, I think China is a bit more cautious. When cooperation isn't very forthcoming on that front, then it is, you know, even less likely that China will want to adopt a more muscular approach in being the only provider of security at the expense of, you know, infringing upon other countries' sovereignty and their jurisdiction in their waters. So I think this is something that I want to, you know, provide a context to. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Abdullah, do you want to add something?
Yeah, well, if you like, I think there is a linkages between the Strait of Malacca, the Hormuz Strait, and also the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And these, if you like, traditional but becoming much more important maritime routes are becoming very, very critical now. And I think we're going to see some competition that is going to take place as to who is going to control these maritime routes. You know, for China, of course, it's more most priority goes, of course, to its neighboring region. And I think in the China Defense paper that was called the China Defense in the New Era was, I think, published in July 2019. They talk about even the idea of using force when it comes to the region here, Southeast Asia, and especially what is known as the 9-line or 10-line or 11-line, however one should describe that. I think, the situation, I agree with previous speakers, it's different in the Gulf. China has interest, of course, its interest is growing, but it knows that this is not like its top priority for China, and it wants to avoid conflict at all costs there. And I think it wants to avoid conflict in Southeast Asia as well, and the South China Sea. However, one should really look at their China defense strategy that was published. And unfortunately, in that, they actually say specifically that when it comes to this region, or to their vital interest, they have threatened to use force. And that's the only time during that document, if you like, they have talked about using force, which is a bit scary, I think, in a sense. But to what extent one would believe that? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from S.Y. Wong, and it is, to what extent do you think a strategy of compartmentalization of the South China Sea issue while maintaining broader Sino-bilateral ties is workable for both claimant states and non-claimant states like Singapore?
Well, the simple answer is it has worked. It is working. The spillover is not very much.
Colin, do you have a response to that?
No, I agree with Ambassador Hari on this.
It's not that there's no spillover, but it's minimal, it's manageable. It's neither in China's interest nor any of the ASEAN countries, including the claimant states, to let this contaminate the entire relationship.
Okay, if anyone has any questions, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you, or you can send it in to typing. Yeah, we have a question from Alex. Alex, do you want to ask Alex from Melbourne Law School? Do you want to ask your question?
Hi, good evening from Melbourne. Thank you for your presentations. I'm Alex de la Cruz. I am doing a PhD at Melbourne Law School, and I was just wondering, I have noticed that big power competition has been a prominent way by which relations with the sea have been described or understood. And I was just wondering whether, to what extent or what is the scope for the notion of the global commons in this kind of framing about the sea as a big power competition, and does that differ in specific maritime contexts? Thank you.
Let me just say very briefly, perhaps controversially, I do not believe international law is an autonomous reality. It is a myth we choose to believe in order that we may occasionally live in a civilized manner. Most of the time, international law, including the concept of a global commons, is an instrument of states' policy. When it's convenient, it will use it. When it's not convenient, it will not use it. Don't mistake international law for something like the law of gravity. In fact, all law is a social construct. Domestic law, much less so. International law, so much more so. It is just an instrument of state policy. And when it's convenient to state interests, they will use it. When it's not convenient, they will disregard it. That's the fact. Colin, you want to add something?
Yeah, I just want to add on to that. I mean, the thing is that, the idea of a global maritime commons, it has been there for the longest time. We talk about, various types of cooperation between, both the coastal states and, of course, the user states. if we go by UNCLOS itself, I mean, it's not a perfect document, but it is what we call a constitution of the oceans, where we talk about the various maritime zones and the type of relationship and behavior and interactions that the various stakeholders can have with each other. When we talk about, for example, territorial waters, EEZ, that has been a problem. The issue here is that, of course, for the EEZ regime, it has always been a contested issue because of the ambiguities that are enshrined within the EEZ regime in UNCLOS as to what we mean by due regard between the coastal states and the user states. But there are always room for cooperation. For the EEZ, you don't really want to call that a global maritime commons, except to acknowledge that high seas rules do apply in the EEZ. But that can be problematic. If you talk about high seas, these are areas where it is possible for these countries to come and cooperate. But in the recent years, even these so-called high seas are becoming increasingly controversial, I would say. I mean, one example, to bring us away from the South China Sea and the Persian Gulf, we go all the way up north, is the Arctic, for example. The Arctic. I mean, the thing is that, the Arctic littoral states have been arguing in certain varying degrees on, how to demilitarize or to prevent the militarization of the Arctic. And much of Arctic itself is pristine, is untapped when it comes to sea lines of communication or resources. But in very recent years, Arctic is going to become increasingly contentious, because if you look at China's case, using these global maritime commons approach to that, it labeled itself, or what they call a near Arctic state, which is a label that is unprecedented. It has no standing in legally when it comes to any other instruments that we saw. The Spitsbergen Treaty has no such label for observers of the Arctic that is outside the Arctic region. But how these countries, for geopolitical reasons, will tap on and exploit the whole notion of global maritime commons to pursue their aims, I think it's something that we need to watch in the coming years. I think China's case in the Arctic is one example to watch after.
Abdullah, do you want to add something?
I totally agree with the previous speaker. So, for the sake of time, I won't add anything here.
Okay. Yeah, while we wait for another question, I want to ask, since we're already on this issue of the global commons, so that's, one thing that I've always wondered is I've always thought that this idea of commons works best when there is a single power in charge. And you've already, and Bilal, you initially mentioned that there has always been competition in US and sort of, unilateralism was a small period, but maybe I'm not sure about that in the seas, because the Soviets were never an oceanic power to that same extent. And even if we go before to earlier periods when you had the British Pax Britannica, Britain was by and large the only power at sea, where you had other land powers but only with sea, and even if we go earlier, you had the Spanish and the Portuguese. Any small power was essentially pirate, and large power was the only real authority. So would you see some kind of reversion overall, like sort of that this bilateral position where there's two legitimate large powers at sea as a sustainable long-term thing?
Look, I repeat, I don't think international law is an autonomous reality. It is an instrument of national interest. Just give you and when they will cooperate when their interests coincide. In 1971, Malaysia and Indonesia said that I forgot the exact legal terminology. They said the Straits of Malacca is not an international straits. It belongs to either of them. Immediately, without any prior coordination that I know of, the 7th Fleet and the Soviet Pacific Fleet sent ships to sail up and down, just to tell them, piss off, you're wrong, and you can't stop me. And if I have no doubt that if the PLA had a navy at that time, they would have sent ships too. When people have something in common interest, they will cooperate. It is not, international regimes are instruments of foreign policy. They don't exist independent of countries' foreign policies. And actually, I dispute this whole idea of global commons. You know, it's a nice idea, it's an aspiration. You know, so we should keep it alive. That's about it.
If I could chime in, I just want to sort of put in my own perspective to what Amin you just mentioned. I'm not so sure how you would characterize the former Soviet Union as essentially an isolated power that isn't that interested in the global maritime commons. Back then, the Soviet Navy, in most respect, I mean, not counting the fact that it didn't have many aircraft carriers compared to US Navy back then, it was an ocean-going navy by and large, and it actually it went beyond its immediate waters in Europe and in the Far East, or the Soviet Far East. Actually, it went all the way down the Indian Ocean. It has a permanent presence in the Indian Ocean as well. So for the PLA Navy, I would suspect, this is going to be, more or less the case, and that, of course, does give avenues for cooperation as and when it's expedient. I mean, we look at the case of the Gulf of Aden. Even though China isn't part of the Combined Task Force 151, it does cooperate as an independent deployer with CTF 151 as and when required. And of course, in the same manner, it cooperates with the EU naval forces in the Gulf of Aden. So depending on the circumstances, depending on the political expediency, they do cooperate despite the differences in the views that they hold, actually. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to we've received some questions. Richard Huang has asked, ASEAN has initiated the rule of engagement till now. Don't seem to go anywhere. Why? Within ASEAN seems not unified in approach. Where do we see from here?
What are you talking about, rules of engagement? I don't understand what he means by rules of engagement. You mean the code of conduct, declaration of conduct?
If you could clarify, Richard Huang. Or we can. He said yes.
Okay, I take it as you are talking about the declaration of conduct and code of conduct. These are again nice ideas, but personally, when I was in the foreign ministry, I would never admit it. But now I'm out, I can. They're very stupid ideas. They will never work. Look, China claims the entire South China Sea, almost, right? If I was China, why should I tie my hands with a declaration of conduct or a code of conduct? These are diplomatic games we play. And I think we in the ASEAN countries are not that stupid. We also play these diplomatic games as a means of engagement. It is because it is better to talk than fight. That basically is. The only codes of conduct that will really matter is between the 7th Fleet and the PLA Navy about unplanned encounters at sea. And by and large, they have unwritten codes of conduct for that right now. Right? No, but look, not just China. If I am a claimant state, right, and I claim a certain chunk of South China Sea, even not a very big chunk, why on earth would I want to tie my hands? It's mine. So why should I submit myself, limit my authority in what I consider my own territory to somebody else? Unless it can be useful to me as an instrument of policy. But right now, I don't see anybody, not China, thinking it's so. Right? Why should China tie its hands? China, don't forget, I come back to this point, believes its domestic law has jurisdiction over most of the South China Sea. The things that Colin mentioned at the beginning, this new administrative regions and all that, that's the essence of what they are trying to do, is to say, this is mine, this is part of China. I let you use it because I'm a nice guy by my leave and favor, but you don't tie my hands. China is discussing a code of conduct with ASEAN because this is what diplomats do. It's better for us to talk than fight. So,
if I could add to Ambassador's point, to elaborate further, is to probably understand more deeply what are these motivations behind having these agreements in the first place. for China, it is in so much as to actually try to exclude other actors from the South China Sea. It must give a reason, a justification to say that we don't need other people to come into matter in the South China Sea. The code of conduct is supposed to achieve that for China by showing or proving, and whether you doubt it or not, that Asian countries or the littoral countries in the South China Sea are able to manage the disputes on their own without having to involve other people. And by that, primarily it will refer to the US. That's what. For ASEAN, by and large, the code of conduct is useful insofar it is meant to reassert and to highlight the relevance of the organization by itself. I mean, if you go and look deeply into the existing single draft negotiating text, it's actually quite telling. Yeah. Living document.
It's not a negotiating text. It's a collection of everybody's ideas.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at the existing
waste paper basket where everybody threw their things in it.
Yes, it is a 9-page document that is, I think, quite painstaking to break apart, because every country just threw everything into the basket, as what Ambassador mentioned. And you find that there's one thing that is very characteristic is that there are no lack of proposals on having those practical cooperation like fishery management and all that, but very, very, very few proposals on binding their hands when it comes to confidence building and security building measures. Vietnam is the only country that bothers to actually define what do we mean by militarization in the South China Sea. The rest kept conspicuously silent on that issue, which thereby reinforced the idea that nobody actually wants to bind their hands, but they are very keen to put forth those diplomatic niceties on the fact that they can cooperate in the South China Sea. Whether it's going to be effective in managing disputes in the South China Sea, I have very serious doubts as to what it is. If you ask me, can turn back the clock, it's actually better that at the very least, we don't even talk about the code of conduct. We should just stick to the existing Declaration on Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea that was signed in November 2002. We stick with that. We build on it instead of putting us on a higher bar, and then potentially we find ourselves falling even harder at the end. Yeah, that's all.
Don't worry, Colin. Nobody has high expectations, so you won't fall.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question from Sean Say from Cambridge University. Sean asked, Colin, you mentioned that plan-US and military relations provide a sort of pressure valve to mounting tensions for posturing. I wonder if the panelists could more clearly articulate how something like naval diplomacy, sometimes remembered by post-colonial nations as gunboat diplomacy, can possibly encourage reconciliation rather than antagonism. How does naval diplomacy fit into the broader practice of foreign relations? And is there a difference in how big navies, such as the U.S. Navy or the Chinese Navy, and small navies can do so?
Well, if I could tap on this question, I mean, in my mind, there is a difference between naval diplomacy in the traditional sense, where we talk about port calls and all these various type of very positive engagements between the various navies. And on the other hand, there is what James Cable in his book described very fittingly as gunboat diplomacy. Is a much different connotation of how naval instrument is being used. By the definition of gunboat diplomacy, it refers to the limited threat or use of the naval force. And of course, naval force these days can be expanded into other realms of instruments that deal with the maritime. So if you want to apply it to Coast Guards, you want to apply it to Air Forces, such as the recent B-1 overflights over the South China Sea. All these could be even considered as gunboat diplomacy in some or another. But the thing is that one thing about naval diplomacy is that it is never immune to broader political intrigues. I mean, we tend to try to convince ourselves sometimes that there's a difference between operational trust and strategic trust between the various actors, such that they could take place in isolation from each other. In this case, when it comes to, say, for example, in the East China Sea, there are instances where even between China and Japan, when ties were on a pretty downside in the recent decade, there are actually some existing cooperation between the two navies in the East China Sea. But in the South China Sea, it might not be as straightforward, because in the first place, in the South China Sea, we don't see that much interactions between the various navies in the region. Not to even mention that, if you discount the broader ASEAN type of multilateral exercises, these are largely very showcase, more for photo exercise opportunities type of thing. Naval diplomacy in this part of the world, I would say, is rather underdeveloped, and in most part, pretty much, subject to the broader political winds. So it is very hard to actually pursue a more institutionalized, a more long-term type of these sort of interactions, other than what we saw as bilateral ones that exist between long-standing allies and partners, like for example between the US and its allies and partners in Southeast Asia. Yes, but with China, it's problematic, I would say.
Can I just add one thing? I think the question is based on a false premise. First of all armed forces are essentially coercive, no matter what you use them for. Secondly, diplomacy is not just about being nice. Coercion is also part of diplomacy. Mm-hmm. So the distinction between naval diplomacy and gunboat diplomacy is, there is a distinction, but it's distinction on a spectrum. Mm-hmm. If I send a ship, a landing ship tank, to send supplies to you for humanitarian purposes, it is a humanitarian purpose, but it's also a reminder, I have a landing ship tank that it is sending supplies today, but tomorrow it may be sending tanks. All right? So don't make the distinction too clear.
Indeed.
Okay, we have another question from Julius Schmidt. And asking, assuming one reason for the South China Sea conflict is securing trade routes, 80% of oil gas supply for China is passing the Straits of Malacca. One approach to mitigate this dependency was to invest in pipelines in Burma. As a result, the US and Japan also increased their political pressure on Burma. Why is the US not allowing China to reduce its dependency?
I don't see the US not allowing China to reduce the dependency. Where?
It would maybe reduce the tension on the South China Sea, yes.
No, look. Has anybody stopped anybody moving? Has anybody stopped oil tankers moving through the South China Sea? Or the Straits of Malacca, or the Sunda Straits, or the Lombok Straits? Nobody. This is contingency planning that all militaries have to go through. It doesn't mean that it's an actuality that somebody is going to stop your oil tank, because that's a casus belli. It's pipelines are frankly as vulnerable as tankers, and probably more vulnerable because they are fixed. They are fixed targets. Ships can at least move around, So these things, these are all very theoretical. Every armed force in the world has to go through this kind of contingency planning. If not, they're not doing their job. They'll be irresponsible. It doesn't mean they really expect things to happen. Now, if I was China, I would do this too, because right now, my oil supply is essentially from the Persian Gulf to wherever I'm bringing it, is essentially being protected by the American 5th and 7th Fleet. Now, that's intolerable for me to continue that. I have to develop my own capabilities.
Just to add on to the point, I mean, in the early part of the decade, there is a sort of budding Chinese literature on what they call a Malacca dilemma. I think that is where all these discussion came about, where the Malacca Strait in particular is seen as the soft underbelly of China. That is very theoretical because so far there is other than the use of existing examples of how the US used force in other parts of the world, the Chinese did not actually provide a convincing argument by which any power would potentially strangle its oil supply other than the hypothetical scenario of a war in this part of the world.
If there's a war, it will happen. But there's no war. It's all theory.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think the Chinese is also now building pipelines to Russia to lessen their commitment on, or to lessen their dependence on this. Yeah.
It lessens their dependence on the sea. It creates new dependencies to Russia.
Exactly.
There is no such thing as zero risk. It's always risk mitigation.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
In fact, the only country in the world that has tried to interfere with oil supplies is Iran.
Ang Kai Lip asks, the Malaysian Agong alluded to the South China Sea in his speech at the parliament yesterday. Yeah. Can you draw the conclusion that Malaysia will take more aggressive stance in the South China Sea under the Mohyuddin administration?
I think it would be premature to draw that conclusion.
Yeah. If I could further to that is that if you look at successive administration, be it whether it's under the Barisan National Government, be it under the Pakatan government or under the current Perikatan government, I think we see more or less, a very standard set of patterns here that will lead to one conclusion, that Malaysia, by and large, doesn't want to rock the boat with China. And if you have seen the MFA statement coming out from Malaysia in the aftermath of the West Capella standoff, that statement is as ambiguous as you can get, but it's very typical Malaysia, right? That it doesn't call out anyone by name, and yet trying to put forward a very ambiguous position on that particular standoff. In the longer term, I wouldn't see Malaysia. This is not a conclusion I'm going to draw from the speech, but I would put forth a sort of prognosis towards the future. Look, Malaysia right now, with the Perikatan government, I think there is a legitimacy issue at stake. The no confidence vote didn't come to pass, yes, but the government remain under question when it comes to its legitimacy, and there is, after all, still a debt pile that was inherited from the previous government. And on top of that, there is not a pandemic-induced economic hardship on the country. With that in mind, it would not be strange or even uncalled for to even conclude that Malaysia does depend on China and will depend on China for all sorts of things like investments and access to market. And the fact that Malaysian policymakers as well as business lobby identified China for the potential post-pandemic recovery that will benefit Malaysia's own economy. So, for these considerations, it will be difficult to conclude that Malaysia would in the future take a much harder stance, but we'll see it in a more subtle way. Say, for example, ramping up engagement with friendly powers like, the Americans or the Australians in terms of, military exercises. But, on the other front of directly confronting China, I think this is probably a little bit too much of a stretch to imagine.
So I think in Western political science theory, international relations theory, hedging, bandwagoning, and balancing are alternatives. In Southeast Asia, they do all simultaneously, right? Look, Najib government was in hock to China up to its eyeballs, but it did not stop the Seventh Fleet from calling at Malaysian ports. It did not stop American surveillance aircraft flying missions occasionally out of Malaysian air bases. I don't know whether the Perikatan government has continued this, but they will continue this in due course because they have to get along with China, they have to get along with America. They have to bandwagon with China for economic benefit. They will find some way of maintaining or developing the relationship with US in order to balance. And they will hedge by developing relationships with Japan, with South Korea, with everybody.
Yeah, we have another question from Benedict Chong, and he asks, it seems that in spite of the great power posturing in the South China Sea, conflict is unlikely to happen or escalate into full-scale conflict. But this cannot be said of the Persian Gulf. How much of this do you think is due to centrality of ASEAN?
I think it has much more to do with the kinds of actors in Southeast Asia vis-a-vis the kinds of actors in the Persian Gulf. We don't have an Iran in Southeast Asia. China is not Iran.
Abdullah, do you want to add something to it too?
Well, I agree with the ambassador. There is much more rationality in this part of the world, and there are also a lot of conflict resolution mechanisms or arrangements that have been put in place. What the Middle East in general and the Gulf in particular lacks is both rationality and also some kind of structure, that they can actually meet and discuss and reduce tension. We don't have that. At the moment, Iran is playing, if you like, this game, but it's also because it feels that it is under sanctions and under pressure. The crippling sanctions, the maximum pressure, pushes Iran to to kind of find ways to poke the Americans in their eyes and the countries. And if this continues, we're just going to have more problems. This is why the region in the Middle East in general, and the Gulf in particular, needs some kind of an arrangement, some kind of a mechanism that not only averts conflicts and build confidence building measures, but also move towards cooperation and coordination. And we need to learn from Asia, and I think there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from the Asian experience. I think Colin and I were recently in the Dead Sea. Do you recall that? And we were talking about something similar to this. I think time has come that the Middle East does learn something from the Asian experience, but also other countries' experience. European experience is also quite relevant to a certain extent.
Okay, we're going to take, I think we have a bunch of questions and short of time, so we'll try to get them quickly. Zhong Han, you asked, China has a policy of non-military interference and is averse to defense partnerships. However, China has established bases in Djibouti and conducted military exercises with Iran. Do you think that China's security posturing is changing? And if so, will it seek to challenge or supplement the US's position in the Gulf like it has in South China Sea and East Asia?
Look, the Chinese posture was making a virtue of lack of capability. As its capabilities develop, it will do more. It's a major power. This is how major powers behave.
If anyone else doesn't have a question, should we go to the next question? Respond. Okay, we can go. Naomi Musao asks, looking at China's land reclamation activities in the South China Sea, what implication will this have to the future of the laws of the sea, and specifically maritime delimitation as we know it?
Well, I mean, if you could ask, I would provide an assessment to that is that, it wouldn't have any impact on the law of the sea, legally speaking. I mean, the thing is that, the fact that you build artificial islands in the South China Sea doesn't change the original legal status of those features in the first place. It doesn't mean you build an island, you can call that an island from now on. You can claim the full suite of maritime entitlements under UNCLOS. That is not supposed to be how it works. I mean, but of course, on the ground, things can be very different. I mean, China will behave in a way that it wants to in this regard of UNCLOS in the first place. But so far, what we actually know about when it comes to South China Sea is that China is more adamant in enforcing what they call a 12 nautical mile limit, whereby within this limit, no foreign military activities should be taking place, and that includes 4 knots, and they will respond in a much more decisive manner. But outside the 12 nautical miles, the argument goes that practically ships of other countries can just go through in any way they want to, but of course that is not discounting the fact that the Chinese do keep that under surveillance anyway. But so far that's what we saw. As I mentioned, you build those islands, it doesn't change the status whatsoever.
We have 2 questions about the COVID crisis, both slightly different. One is S.Y. Wong is asking about how would this affect the military spending, specifically naval spending, the COVID financial crisis? Will we now see countries sort of reducing their spending, given that they had spent so much in the last decade? So that's one question. And another question is from Justin Chua, who's asking if the COVID crisis and Trump blaming China for it will lead to growing tensions between China and the US, and how will this affect the South China Sea situation as well?
Well, I'll answer the last question and I'll leave the other one to a thing. Obviously, it's going to make the relationship more tense. It's not just the US blaming Trump. Not just Trump blaming the Chinese. There are quite a number of countries wanting to hold the Chinese accountable. And the Chinese have retaliated in kind. I mean, conspiracy theories are not a monopoly of one country or the other, you know. A lot of the anti-Chinese sentiment, by the way, in the world, before COVID and after, is of China's own doing, you know. Remember that. We are in a new phase of US-China relations, which is going to be a prolonged phase. From 1972, when they re-established relations, there were moments of tension over Taiwan and South China Sea and other issues. But overall, the trajectory of the relationship was towards engagement. Now they have switched. They have switched quite fundamentally. There will still be engagement, moments of engagement, but the overall trajectory is towards strategic competition and more tension. I don't think there will be war, but this is the new normal of that relationship. Higher tension, lower tension.
I will, bite on the question on defense spending. I don't have on hand the available data or statistics that will point to the future due to COVID-19, but at least in this part of the world, Southeast Asia, which is what I'm primarily tracking, where we are now seeing signs of COVID-19 having an impact on defense spending. You look at Thailand's case. Thailand has decided to slash 30% of its naval budget, and that will affect downstream its existing contracts, say with China. So we probably won't see all 3 submarines coming to service very soon. We'll probably see 1 submarine coming in, and then funding will be deferred in the coming future for follow-on units. We see in the Philippines where there is a promise to keep to the contracted acquisitions and those in the pipeline, but there won't be any further new acquisitions in play. So we see that COVID-19 has some impact on especially the much smaller militaries in this part of the world, in particular. Those countries that have traditionally been more preoccupied with spending more money on social security, they'll continue to do even more of that because of the pressing priorities that will require them to make a change from the current pandemic crisis. The fact that they have to put more money into healthcare other than just into creating jobs is going to create a pressure on Southeast Asian countries by and large. And of course, if we can project it further, we'll see that likely in Europe as well.
Can I say something on this? I think
yes.
Conspiracy theory aside, I think the transactional nature of Trump is that he's not going to let an opportunity like this go away without taking an advantage of it in his negotiations with, especially trade negotiations with China, to get the best deal. So I think he's doing, in a sense, a good job in terms of using this COVID-19 as something to kind of force China into giving more, if you like, in terms of the trade relationships that they have, and especially that they've just signed the first agreement and the next agreement is being negotiated. So this is a great opportunity for them. And that's
most of the anti-Chinese feeling is created by China itself. I think Trump is using it because if he tried to create it out of nothing, he would fail.
Okay, we can maybe have the last question by Asif Shajai, and we can take the closing comments with everyone. And it's Asif is from MEI as well. Thus, can any conflict in the world history be seen as comparable to the current South China Sea situation? Is there any situation currently in any other part of the world which could be compared to this conflict?
I didn't get the first part. You mean the US-China conflict?
The South China Sea and the U.S.-China conflict. Is there any other conflict that's sort of similar and comparable?
South China Sea and the US-China conflict are typical great power competitions. I don't see anything unique about them, either in their nature or their intensity.
I think the question was, is there anything in the world that is comparable to it? Is that what he's trying to ask?
Okay. You have the tensions between Russia and Europe. You have Iran and its neighbors. These are the normal dynamics, I would call them, unfortunately, of international relations.
And each one is different in many ways.
Each one is different. It's got its own peculiarities. Yeah. But the essential, if you want to get philosophical about it, the root cause is the nature of the state system and maybe human nature, which is evil.
Colin, would you like to add something to that?
Oh, no, I have nothing further to add to that.
Okay, then we're almost out of time as well. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I want to take time to applaud all the speakers today.